I have no contact with my parents and some of my extended relatives. And my husband also has no contact with his parents and much of his extended family. And we don't talk about it a lot because it's a controversial issue, for one thing, but the other reason is because so few people are willing to take the time to understand what led to that decision. If you just think that there's no reason for anyone to ever go no contact with family members, you should just skip past it, and I won't think anything of it. But also know that anything that you say that is negative or rude will be blocked and deleted. I just don't have space to give continuing explanations to people who aren't willing to take the time to understand. We went no contact with my husband's family about 5 years ago. And it wasn't a decision we took lightly. And it took me personally over 15 years of being in regular contact with his family and of building a life together with my husband before I finally recognized that that was the only option we had. And I'm gonna give a few details here, but I need those of you who are watching this to understand that this isn't up for discussion or debate. This is the experience we had, and I'm sharing it in the hopes that others who have had to make this decision or maybe considering it will know that somebody else gets it and that they're not alone in making this really hard decision for their families. How did I end up no contact with my husband's family? How did our family make that decision? It wasn't one that happened quickly. When I first met my husband, which was over 20 years ago now, when we were both in college, very soon as I started to get to know him, I recognized that he had a lot of conflict and a lot of anger towards his parents. And the mistake I made right off the bat was in assuming that it was standard teenage conflict with family type stuff, the sort of thing that every normal teen goes through. And that was the way his parents played it off. And he just seemed to be very upset and sensitive, and I'm telling you how I felt about it at the time. So understand that my opinions on this have changed, but I'm trying to share where I was at the time. He seemed very hurt and unwilling to try to work towards a resolution with his family. And I assumed that it was a problem in his heart and his life. We're Christians, and so I was under the impression that Christians should always try to work things out. And I also held this belief that if, as a Christian, I went and tried to work something out with someone else, according to the principles that are laid out in Matthew 5 for conflict resolution. Sorry, it might not be Matthew 5, but in the book of Matthew, there's some principles laid out for conflict resolution between Christians. And I was under the simplistic understanding that if a Christian found they were in conflict with another Christian and they followed those conflict resolution steps, that the conflict would be resolved because you did everything right in your conflict resolution, and therefore, of course, conflict would be resolved. What I didn't count on is the fact that you have to have two willing parties for a conflict to be resolved. And so in the situation with my husband and his parents, as I got to know him and over the years, I came to realize that that was not the case. There was only one party who was willing to do any work, make any effort toward reconciliation, and that was my husband. A couple of years before we decided to go no contact with my husband's family, we moved to Oregon from California, which is where they live. I think they live, I don't really know for sure, but where they lived and where we at that time lived. So we moved up to California, and we had been pulling back from spending a lot of time with them for several years at that point. There was a time when we tried to get down there once a month to see them. They were about an hour and a half away from us, so we would load up all our kids and go down and see them every month. And we would try to get there for birthdays, for family occasions, holidays, things like that. And most of the time it was us going down to them, even though we had 3 children and were pregnant with the 4th by that point. So we moved up here to Oregon, and we had already been, like I said, pulling away because we were seeing the cost it was having on our family. And I was seeing that my husband, anytime we spent any time with his parents, whenever we were with them, he would come back and it would throw him into an emotional tailspin. He would be in a state of crash for several days afterwards. Now, we didn't know he had undiagnosed ADHD at the time, and I was just starting to see that he was having depression-like symptoms and severe anxiety symptoms, but I didn't even know what those actually looked like. I didn't know what symptoms for that looked like at the time. Looking back now, I see, oh, the symptoms had been present for years, and I just didn't understand what was triggering them so much. But I started to recognize that every time we spent time with them, it would take him several days to get back to sort of a state of normal and balance. And I couldn't understand why that was, because I wasn't seeing what it was that was causing the issues. And so we moved up here to Oregon, and we had less time with them consistently because now we had to go down to them, which was a 1,000-mile drive, or they had to fly up to us. And so we saw them less often. But that year, right after we moved up here, we had our 5th child. And so I was nursing an infant, and we made trips down to see them 2 or 3 times that year, in that first year when I had my infant son. And they made a couple of trips up to us. And I started to notice, because I was only seeing them occasionally, I noticed in that year, I came down with mastitis, which is an infection of breast tissue that happens when you're nursing. I came down with it within a week, either before or after I was spending time with them, every single time. I had never had mastitis with any of my other kids, but literally every time we were going to see them, or we were seeing them, or had just gotten back from seeing them, I came down with mastitis. And mastitis, like I said, is an infection. So I noticed that physically something weird was going on with my system. This was my 5th child. It wasn't usual for me. And then I started to notice that physically I was having symptoms after or before or during spending time with his family. And twice, close to times when his parents were coming to visit, I recognized that I was starting to have like nausea, panicky feeling in my stomach leading up to their visit, that it was causing me significant stress. An actual physical reaction was happening to me, to my body, when I knew that they were planning on coming. And that was really weird for me. I couldn't figure out, like, why would they be having this effect on me? And I was in counseling at the time, and I'm very thankful. I was there for something completely different, unrelated to that. But because I was there, the counselor said, well, that's really, interesting. Why do you think your body's responding that way? And that was kind of the first inkling I had where my brain started to take the time, 5 years of fog, 10 years of fog, really, of having children every 2 years. And so being nursing, pregnant, all of that, not having a whole ton of time to really assess any feelings. But finally I did. I was working with the counselor, and I finally did. And I said, oh, I noticed that when I know my family's coming into town, when I know my husband's family's coming into town, it's a huge stressor for me. And the counselor said, that's interesting. And so anyway, they were planning a visit in January, and we had made the plans to have them. And my grandpa, who lived here with us in Oregon in this area, my dad's father, died suddenly. He was old, so it wasn't exactly unexpected, but he just had a very short, acute illness and died. Like, he was in the hospital one night, the next day he was gone. And the day after that was when my husband's parents were supposed to come and visit. So obviously we're all in shock and trying to figure out what is going on here. And so we called them the day before, as soon as, we realized that my grandpa was in the hospital and probably wasn't coming home, or at least it was going to be a very serious issue. We had called them and said, can you please reschedule and come visit us at a different time? We need you to cancel. We can't have you right now. This was not okay with them. My husband's parents threw a legit tantrum over the fact that we were telling them they couldn't come and visit. And they said, oh, we'll come up and we'll help. We'll come up and we'll be super, we won't be any trouble. We'll just come up and hang out with the kids and take care of the kids and take care of things at your house, and you can do what you need to with your grandpa. And first of all, that was totally fake because they had already planned to have a wheelchair for my father-in-law, and my mother-in-law had spent hardly any time at my house. She's never been the kind of person to show up at someone's house and do everything. Like, she doesn't even know where to start with that. And she was asking for them to come up and for us to basically hand off our kids to them for several days while we dealt with arrangements for my grandpa's funeral and things like that. So at a time when my family is in the middle of grieving something shocking and huge, my mother-in-law and father-in-law wanted to take the kids away and just handle them so that they wouldn't have to deal with any of the grieving stuff. I just knew that was not helpful or healthy in any way. Kids need to be present and part of the grief process so that they understand how it goes. And so we just said, no, we really need you to reschedule. That was not okay with them. So my mother-in-law tried everything she could to get us to change what we were saying, to still be able to come up and have their fun weekend with the kids 2 days after my grandpa had died suddenly. And we told them flat out, no, if you come, we can't stop you getting on the airplane, but if you come, you will not be seeing us because we're going to be present for my family. We're going to be working with our kids through this grief. We aren't going to have space to see you. My mother-in-law and father-in-law were very upset by this and decided to take it personally as though we were somehow not letting them be a part of things. And they were not okay with the fact that we asked them to reschedule their visit, which was to come up and have fun with the kids. We asked them to reschedule it. And at first they tried to say it was because they couldn't cancel their airline tickets, but that turned out to be bogus because she called and the airline, of course, said, oh, your family had a death in the family. Well, of course we can reschedule or refund you the money or whatever they did. But anyway, that didn't even end up being an issue. So we just left it with my mother and father-in-law that way. We couldn't bother saying anything else about it because we were trying to deal with my grandpa had just died very suddenly. So the funeral finishes, we handle all the arrangements, helping my family through it. My dad did most of the arrangements, but I was right next door, literally, is where we lived. So we were working on that. And we realized we needed to call and try and sort things out with Brian's parents. And so we scheduled a call. We asked my parents to watch our kids so that we wouldn't be interrupted, and we scheduled a Zoom call because they live down in California. And that call was a huge turning point in my understanding of my husband's relationship with his parents. We were having this phone call to try to express to them what we felt and how that made us feel, like that they would insist on coming to visit us at a time when we were dealing with, this is the first death that anyone close to me has died in a very long time. It was the first relative of mine that had ever passed away in that amount of time. My kids had spent time with my grandfather, and so I was working through things with them. I was supporting my parents, my dad especially, because it was his dad. And my mother-in-law and father-in-law could not see any reason why it would be okay for us to ask them to delay their trip. We didn't ask them to cancel the trip completely. We didn't say never come again. We just asked them to put their trip for another time. That was not okay by them. They had a major issue with that. And so we talked through it, and there was a lot of drama, for lack of a better phrase, a lot of crying, a lot of tears from my mother-in-law, and a lot of my father-in-law looking contemptuously at us over the Zoom camera. And we came out of that conversation, and nothing really had been resolved. It was all just, oh, we don't understand why you guys are being this way. And my husband was livid. He had to go just take a walk and walk off the energy. And I came out of the conversation thinking it had gone okay. And he came out it was really bad. He was really hurt, upset. I could tell this was impacting him, and I didn't really understand the why. So we finished this conversation, and that night we were having our date night, and I was just trying to understand what had happened there, because our reactions were very different to this phone call. And I decided to Google emotional manipulation. I don't know why. All I can say is God nudged me. That's the best explanation I have. I'm not really even sure why I did that, but I Googled it, and there was a Wikipedia article, and it listed 20 different forms of emotional manipulation, specific examples and what it's called. I think it's like bandstanding, belittling. It listed each of these words and each of these types of emotional manipulation and the kinds of statements people would make with them. And as I read this list, more than half of the statements that were given as examples had been said in our Zoom conversation. And a bulb lit for me, and I was like, oh. And that was like a lightning bolt for me. I suddenly realized that my husband's parents were manipulating things, because I just didn't know what emotional manipulation looked like. I'd never had that explained to me. And you can tell when someone's obviously doing it, right? When they're doing it bad. But people who've been doing it their whole lives, they're really good at it. And I just never realized that someone would want to manipulate another person that way, that somebody would do that on purpose. I assumed that maybe they didn't know they were doing it, or that they didn't recognize the harm it was causing. But in that moment, when I saw that list and started reading through it and realized how many of those types of statements had been made in one single Zoom call, I finally saw what my husband had been saying for years. And so I went back to my counselor and I explained this to her, and we talked through it, and I continued to be in therapy with her for several months afterwards. But I realized that for my husband's mental health and for our family's safety, that we needed to severely limit contact with his parents, because they had no qualms about crossing any boundaries we put up. And it was interesting because around that time I read the book Boundaries in Marriage, because I was sorting through some things with my husband. And the funniest part of it was that as I was reading the book Boundaries in Marriage, nearly every thing that I highlighted or underlined, I saw in my relationship with my in-laws. So it wasn't my husband who I was learning the most about. I was learning that my in-laws consistently crossed boundaries inappropriately. And I finally realized that my husband had been pointing this out for years and had been trying to work things out with his parents. So they were aware, because he had done everything he could to communicate it. They just didn't want to change. So I finally recognized that my husband had been living through years of this kind of emotional manipulation crap. That's the nicest word I can use. But, so I realized this, and I finally understood why he would so often tailspin after visiting with them. There were things that he was picking up on because of his long-term relationship with his family, that they knew how to jab him in ways that I couldn't see or even perceive, and to an outsider would look like nothing, because they weren't directed at me, they were directed at him. And so talked with our counselors, both of us went to our counselors and talked to them about, okay, so wow, this is really bad. And I finally said to him, and he had wanted to limit contact or even maybe go no contact with them for years off and on, and I'd always talked him out of it because I thought that he was just being bitter, unforgiving, and I loved him and I wanted him to have that opportunity. Nobody cuts off their parents, right? And that's what I had been taught, and that's what I had learned. But this time I said, if you need to not ever talk to them again, I'm okay with that, because I see how it's impacting you. And just me being able to validate that I saw what he saw, that I realized the kind of damage their interactions with him were causing him, and also our family, as we started to recognize working through things. My validation of his experience and my willingness to stand with him and do what he needed to do for his mental health made a huge difference in his mental health and his ability to keep moving forward and his ability to grow and heal. just having one person witness that made a big difference for him. And so we made the decision to not have contact with his parents. We started sending back gifts and cards. Eventually we had to change our phone numbers, block them on social media. Any place where they could get a hold of us, we did. We blocked it. We shut shut down the way to us. And it wasn't like it was a shock to them, but only because they hadn't heard us say it multiple times before. When people are abusive, when people are manipulative, when people are unwilling to change, unwilling to look at themselves, they don't want to hear it, and so they don't.